9 years in apartment 87. The wind whistles low and desolate through apartment 87, carrying the faint scent of the desert and something else, something far less natural. For nearly a decade, I've called this place home, tucked away in a nameless town in the heart of New Mexico, isolated from the rest of the world. My name's Zach, at least for the sake of anonymity. 9 years ago, I stumbled into this town with nothing but a half-working car, an empty wallet, and a heart full of restlessness. The town is barely more than a dot on a forgotten map, sustained by a tepid trinity, a church, a gas station, and the aging apartment complex where I've spent every waking and sleeping moment since. It's the kind of town you either love or loathe, with its dusty streets, stagnant summers, and endless parade of drifters who seem as lost as the town itself. A magnetic pull exists here, drawing in all manner of wanderers, seekers, and lost souls. They come for the quiet, for the simplicity, or perhaps for something deeper, something that's hard to put into words. I've heard it described as purgatory, a way station for the damned and hopeful alike, a nowhere place that's oddly perfect for those who don't quite fit anywhere else. The long road to nowhere. 13 years ago, I was just another college kid burning through an inheritance I didn't deserve. Stifled by the narrow halls of academia, I dropped out, packed what little I owned into my old car, and drove west with no plan, no destination. My parents had passed years before, their adventurous spirits left to haunt me, guiding my hands on the wheel. I hit every small town I could find, lingering in forgotten diners and abandoned motels, feeding off the strangeness of the open road. When my car finally coughed its last breath on a deserted stretch of highway, I was 2 hours from the nearest speck of civilization. The car sputtered, spewed smoke, and died, stranding me in a sea of red dirt and blue sky. Then came Winkle. James Van Winkle, known simply as Winkle, pulled up in a wood-paneled station wagon like some apparition from an old VHS movie. Gray hair combed back, Hawaiian shirt unbuttoned one button too low, and a perpetual smirk that said he'd seen it all. He rolled down the window, a cassette of Def Leppard's Pyromania blaring from the speakers. "Car trouble?" he asked with a grin that didn't quite reach his eyes. I told him my situation, and he offered me a ride back to town, no strings attached. Winkle was the owner of the gas station, the only gas station. It's not much, a crumbling box of nostalgia filled with faded posters and a television set stuck on static. It's where the town gathers to gossip, where time seems to have stopped somewhere around 1987. Winkle's been here forever, or so it feels. He's a fixture, a dusty monument to a simpler time. Winkle and I hit it off right away. He's the kind of guy who knows every secret, every dark corner of this place. We spent that first ride talking about the town's holy trinity, the gas station, the church, and the apartment complex. "Not much, but it's home," Winkle had said with a half-shrug. I didn't realize then just how literal he meant it. The keeper of the complex. Then there's the complex. An old, imposing structure built back in the 70s, an architectural Frankenstein's monster of concrete, glass, and rusted metal. The tenants call it the Citadel, though no one knows who started that. Mr. Rags owns the place, a reclusive figure who supposedly lives on the sealed-off 17th floor. No one's ever seen him come or go, and the elevator doesn't have a button for his floor, just a tarnished metal panel that hums with an unsettling silence when pressed. Mr. Rags is a mystery wrapped in layers of faded linen shirts and cryptic smiles. No one knows his real name, his history, or why he built this place. Rumors swirl among the tenants like dust in the desert wind, that he's a retired magician, a scientist who went mad, or some kind of twisted philanthropist running a social experiment no one signed up for. But every time I've seen him, he's been tending to the lush rooftop garden no one has access to, cutting flowers that seem to bloom only for him. It's the way he smiles, thin and calculated, that unsettles me most, as if he knows far more than anyone here should. The complex itself is like a living organism, with its own rules, its own rhythm. A couple on the 15th floor runs a communal kitchen, cooking meals for the tenants with food funded by a mysterious portion of our rent. Most evenings, it's a low-key affair, the soft clinking of silverware, quiet conversations in languages half-remembered, and the ever-present hum of the old fluorescent lights that buzz like trapped flies. It's a place caught between worlds, one where the past refuses to let go and the future never arrives. The offer you can't refuse. The day Winkle brought me to the complex was the first time I met Mr. Rags. Winkle buzzed the intercom, a crackling, disembodied voice answering, as if from a different era altogether. There was a brief, tense exchange before Winkle motioned for me to follow him into the elevator. As the doors slid shut, I felt a strange sensation, like being swallowed whole. The elevator surged upward, far too fast and impossibly smooth. 17 floors flashed by in an instant, and when the doors opened, I stood before an ornate door marked 1701. Mr. Rags was waiting, a thin man with sunken eyes that seemed to miss nothing. "You must be Zach," he said, his voice smooth and deliberate. "I hear you're in need of a place to stay." There was no refusing him. In retrospect, I can't even remember what I said, only that I agreed to stay in apartment 87, a unit that had supposedly been abandoned only weeks before. Everything was pristine, waiting. Towels neatly folded, food in the fridge that never seemed to spoil, and a bed that looked as if it hadn't been touched in decades. It was like stepping into a dream, or perhaps a trap set long before I arrived. "You'll be comfortable here," Mr. Rags had said. "And if you find yourself enjoying it, perhaps you could stay longer. We're always in need of a good handyman." The night of the goat. I slept on the couch that first night, wrapped in a blanket that smelled faintly of lavender and something else, something old. Just as I was drifting off, a piercing, inhuman shriek shattered the stillness, jolting me awake. I rushed to the window, heart pounding, and peered into the darkness below. That's when I saw him, Mr. Rags, hunched near the cactus garden, holding a wild goat by the neck. I watched in frozen horror as he tore into the animal with an unnerving ferocity, blood splattering his white shirt. It was not the act of a man but something far more primal, almost ritualistic. His movements were deliberate, and when he finally looked up, his eyes met mine. I pulled back from the window, breathless, terrified, but unable to turn away. He smiled, a slow, knowing smile that made my skin crawl, and then he disappeared into the shadows, dragging the limp carcass behind him. The next morning, I found a note slipped under my door. "To our newest resident, we humbly welcome you to your first night of supper downstairs in the cafe. Tonight, we're serving curried goat. I've stayed in apartment 87 for 9 years now. I've seen things, heard things, felt things that defy explanation. This town, this complex, Mr. Rags, they're all part of something that's impossible to escape. I came here by accident, or perhaps by fate, and I don't know if I'll ever leave. But maybe that's the point." The secrets of the 17th floor. 9 years in apartment 87 have changed me in ways I never anticipated. The strange, unseen currents that flow through the complex, Mr. Rags' unsettling smiles, the odd quirks of my neighbors, the nights filled with whispers and shadows, are more than just the backdrop of my life. They've become part of my own story, woven into my days like a silent, sinister thread. This town, once a bizarre sanctuary, has turned into something else, a place where time feels warped, where people disappear without warning, and where the past refuses to stay buried. For years, I tried to ignore the strangeness that crept at the edges of my vision. I told myself it was all in my head, that there was a logical explanation for every shiver of unease, every flicker of motion in the corner of my eye. But apartment 87 has a way of breaking you down, revealing truths you'd rather keep hidden. And the more you try to escape, the tighter the complex's grip becomes. The first time I noticed the changes was subtle, a missing item here, a strange sound there. A book I was sure I left on the nightstand would vanish, only to reappear on a different shelf days later. The fridge, which was always stocked with food I couldn't remember buying, began to fill with oddities, jars of cloudy, unrecognizable substances, meat with no discernible source, and vegetables that looked fresh but never seemed to rot. I could never shake the feeling that something was watching, something beyond Mr. Rags' omnipresent gaze. Then there were the neighbors. Mrs. Meyer from the second floor, the one who dutifully delivered meals to Pastor John, began to wear gloves every time she stepped out of her apartment, even on the hottest summer days. She told me once, in a rare moment of candor, that the complex had changed her skin, that the air itself felt like poison. I thought she was being dramatic until I saw the red, raw patches on her wrists where the gloves didn't quite cover. Others spoke in hushed tones about dreams that felt too real, of voices whispering in languages no one could place, of doors that led to places they shouldn't. But the real turning point came when I met Cora. Cora moved into the complex about 3 months ago, taking up residence in apartment 73. She was young, barely out of her 20s, with an air of defiance that marked her as an outsider. Unlike most of the other residents, who had long since surrendered to the complex's peculiarities, Cora questioned everything. She asked about the locked 16th floor, about the missing residents no one seemed to talk about, and about the eerie way the lights on the 17th floor flickered late at night, even though no one was supposed to be up there. She had a theory, one that I didn't want to hear, but couldn't ignore. Cora believed that Mr. Rags was more than just the eccentric landlord of this crumbling monument. She thought he was feeding off us, that the complex itself was some kind of living entity that drew its strength from the people trapped within. She had pages of notes, old photos, and newspaper clippings that documented the disappearances of former tenants, strange occurrences dating back to when the complex was first built. There were rumors of secret tunnels, hidden rooms, and something far more sinister lurking just beyond the walls. "The complex doesn't just house people, Zach," she said one night, her voice trembling as she spread out her evidence across my kitchen table. "It consumes them. It consumes us." I wanted to dismiss her as paranoid, but the truth was, I'd seen too much to ignore. There were too many coincidences, too many inexplicable moments. And then, one evening, Cora went missing. No one seemed to notice at first. She wasn't close to anyone in the complex, and her absence was easy to overlook in a place where people often kept to themselves. But when her apartment was found empty, the door left ajar, it was as if a silent alarm had been triggered. I felt a familiar knot of dread tighten in my stomach. There was no sign of struggle, no indication that she had packed up and left. Her things were still there, untouched, her shoes by the door, a half-finished cup of coffee on the counter, and her notes meticulously organized on the table. All that remained was a single, crumpled piece of paper left on her bed. It was a drawing, scrawled hastily in pen. A crude sketch of the complex with one detail that sent a shiver through me, a gaping, dark hole where the 17th floor should have been, surrounded by jagged lines that resembled teeth. Below the drawing, in frantic, slanted handwriting, were the words, "It's hungry." That night, I couldn't sleep. The walls felt closer, the air thicker. I stared at the ceiling, the shadows twisting into unfamiliar shapes. Around 3 a.m., I heard the hum of the elevator. No one uses the elevator at that hour, not unless they want to risk running into Mr. Rags or something worse. I got up, my heart hammering, and peered through the peephole. The hallway was empty, but I could hear faint footsteps above me, impossibly distant yet unmistakable. Driven by a mixture of fear and morbid curiosity, I grabbed my keys and headed toward the stairwell. I had to know what was on the 17th floor. It was like a siren's call, pulling me upward against every instinct screaming for me to turn back. As I climbed, the air grew colder, heavier, and each step felt like wading through thick, invisible sludge. At the top, the stairwell ended in a door marked with faded, weathered numbers, 1701. It was the same door I'd seen years before, but it looked different now, older, like it had been standing there for centuries. My hand shook as I reached for the doorknob, half expecting it to burn at my touch. The door swung open with a soft creak, revealing a dimly lit hallway that seemed to stretch on forever, impossibly long, impossibly dark. The walls were lined with portraits of people I didn't recognize, their faces twisted in expressions of sorrow, fear, and something else, resignation. As I walked, the hallway seemed to shift, the floor beneath me undulating like the belly of some massive, slumbering beast. At the end of the hall, a large, ornate door loomed, flanked by 2 flickering candles that cast distorted shadows against the walls. I pushed it open, and there, in the center of a vast, cavernous room, stood Mr. Rags. He was dressed in the same linen clothes, his back to me, staring at a wall covered in hundreds of photographs, residents, past and present, all pinned like specimens on display. Some faces were crossed out, some circled, and others had notes scrawled beside them in a language I couldn't read. My own photo was there too, pinned neatly at eye level, unmarked but unmistakable. He turned slowly, his eyes locking onto mine. For a moment, the room felt like it was collapsing inward, like the walls themselves were alive and breathing, pulsing with a slow, deliberate rhythm. "You've come to see, haven't you?" he said softly, almost gently. "This place, it's not just bricks and mortar. It's a legacy. My legacy. It's a home for those who have nowhere else, a place that provides. But it demands something in return." He gestured around the room, to the photos, to the shadows that seemed to stretch and writhe. "Every tenant, every life, becomes part of the complex. It's how we survive, how we thrive. It's how you've survived, Zach." I wanted to scream, to run, but my legs wouldn't move. I could feel the truth sinking in, cold and unrelenting. The complex wasn't just a building. It was alive, feeding off the hopes, fears, and souls of those who called it home. And I was part of it now, inextricably bound to its walls. Mr. Rags walked toward me, his smile as thin and sharp as a blade. "You can't leave, Zach. Not really. You belong here. In the complex, it's always hungry." I stumbled back, my mind reeling, and before I knew it, I was back in the stairwell, the door to 1701 shut firmly behind me. I don't remember the descent, only the feeling of being swallowed by the darkness. I made it back to apartment 87 and locked the door, my hands shaking as I slid down to the floor. I haven't left since. Not really. I can't. Every night, I hear the faint hum of the elevator, the soft whispers of those who have disappeared, and the low, insistent growl of something far below. The complex keeps us, feeds on us, and no one ever truly leaves. The next day, a new resident moved into apartment 73. No one mentioned Cora, and her belongings were gone, as if she'd never existed. But I know. I remember. And I know it's only a matter of time before my own photo on that wall is crossed out. The complex is always hungry. And it never, ever lets you go.